Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am Professor Melinda Negron-Gonzales of the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. And I am very pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion on careers in international development and humanitarian assistance. So today's session is going to focus especially on those two sectors, and I'm going to get us started by providing a brief and very general overview of the international development and humanitarian assistance sectors. And then I'm going to turn it over to our three esteemed panelists that we have here. And they will spend some time sharing their own personal career journeys with all of you. And then finally, we'll end with a Q&A session so that you can ask our panelists and myself any questions you may have. So I am going to share my screen with you. From degree to impact, careers in international development and humanitarian relief. So I want to start by talking a bit about some of the topical areas where we're seeing job growth. We have seen a lot of talk about climate adaptation and environmental sustainability. And indeed, there's been considerable job growth in that area. And so just so you know, for this brief overview, I'm especially using data from ReliefWeb, which is a humanitarian information portal that is run by the United Nations Office for Coordination of Human Affairs. And I'm also using reporting on jobs data by DevEx, which is a leading platform for global development and humanitarian professionals. And so back to topical growth areas, lots of growth in the climate adaptation and environmental sustainability areas. In fact, here, climate and environmental sustainability projects received about an 18% funding increase from the Green Climate Fund and other similar climate finance mechanisms in the past several years. And that's really spurred demand for specialists in climate adaptation and also in disaster risk reduction. There's also been growth in the global health area, as well as gender equality and women's empowerment. And then finally, if you read the newspaper, you know there is a lot of conflict around the world, and we are seeing growth in conflict resolution and peace building roles. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Carsey School of Public Policy has master's programs that cover all of these areas, particularly our Global Conflict and Human Security master's degree and our master's degree in community development. So let's talk a bit about the most in-demand professions here. Monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning specialists are in high demand these days. These meal roles are up around 15%-ish across major NGOs over the past several years as organizations increasingly monitor and evaluate their impact in order to maintain funding. There's also been job growth in the project and program manager roles at various organizations in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. There is growth in roles for technical experts, particularly in areas like health, agriculture, engineering, climate. Again, there's always a lot to do in these organizations for finance and grant management professionals. And then finally, again, if you watch the news or read the newspaper, you know that there are a lot of humanitarian crises around the world, and there's been an uptick in humanitarian logistics and operations positions. In fact, the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies noted a 20% rise in logistics and operations job profiles in these high crisis contexts over the past several years. Okay, let's talk a little bit about recruitment trends, and this information comes from DevX. We've seen on DevX's job board that the NGO, the international NGO with the most job posts was the Danish Refugee Council, and that was for last year's job board. And something else to note was that Mercy Corps made it into the top 5 of the INGOs posting job opportunities on DevX's job board. UNICEF does a lot in a lot of places, and last year UNICEF's 7,034 postings were the most of any organization tracked by DevX. In terms of opportunities at multilateral development banks, the multilateral development bank with the most job posts on DevX was the Asian Development Bank, and a lot of that was for work on climate adaptation. And then finally, in terms of consulting organizations with the most job posts on DevX, we have Chemonics International, DT Global, and then finally Management Systems International, or MSI. So here are just some resources for those of you who are students at UNH. Of course, the Career and Professional Success Office has people you can speak with to work on resume building and practice for interviews. They also have a trove of information about development and humanitarian jobs, as well as foreign affairs jobs. The Carsey School of Public Policy, of course, you can email me. My email is up there. And also Dr. Rivera, who we have with us here today from the Carsey School. We're always happy to speak to you if you are a UNH student, or if you are not a UNH student but are considering coming to UNH, we're always happy to speak with you also about careers in these areas. And then finally, the U.S. State Department diplomat in residence for New England, Michelle Kaiser, couldn't make it tonight, but she emphatically requested that I share with you her contact information. She is always happy to speak to students and people who are considering going into a career in foreign affairs, especially for the State Department. And so you can contact her either through LinkedIn, or you can contact her through her page on careers.state.gov. Okay. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our panelist. I have asked each of them to speak for no more than 10 minutes about their personal career journey and things they learned along the way, as well as what they do in their day-to-day role. We have with us this evening Pushmeet Bhatia. She is currently the Director of Assurance at BDO USA. We have Dr. Jolan Rivera. He is a faculty member of the Carsey School of Public Policy. He's also a consultant for the Carsey School Center for Impact Finance. And we also have Ralph Koehring, who is the Senior Director for Global Ethics and Compliance at URC. Welcome to them. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see them. And I'm going to start with Ralph, who has held numerous roles at various organizations. He's done things for the Department of Homeland Security. He served as Deputy Mission Director and in other senior roles at USAID. And as I mentioned, he's currently the Senior Director for Global Ethics and Compliance for URC, which is a global company dedicated to improving health outcomes around the world. So we'll start with Mr. Koehring and then move on to Ms. Bhatia, and then last but certainly not least, my colleague at Carsey, Dr. Rivera. Ralph?
Thank you so much, Melinda. It's great to be able to talk to you tonight about maybe it's morning also where you're sending it from, but about international development, especially at this critical juncture, because it would be easy to think that because international development is under question at the U.S. government level and how we do it, that it would be diminishing as a job area. But as Melinda just showed through the numbers, and there is no doubt in my mind that it is going to continue to grow. Um, and in all the particular areas that were highlighted in her initial slides. Just a little bit of my background. My father and mother were in the first class of USAID in 1961. And I joined USAID so I grew up in USAID and overseas, mainly in Africa. He was an economist with USAID and then a mission director and one of the first senior career diplomats in USAID history. And then I joined a little bit after and started my professional career with USAID and the US government in 1999. And recently retired a couple years ago and joined URC. So just a little bit about my career path, very briefly. Initially, when I graduated from University of Vermont, so very close by, near neighbor in Burlington, Vermont, in history and political science. So kind of a broad liberal arts degree, not really focusing, knowing that I was going to do a master's. And I did my master's eventually in business administration. Why did I choose that? I had a passion for international development, and what I realized was if I wanted to build a career in international development, I needed to start setting the building blocks that were going to be most useful for that career and areas where I had skills and interests. And so an MBA made a lot of sense for what USAID and a lot of organizations needed at the time I was looking for a job. And so that's one of the things that I want you to think about as you're thinking about career path is your skills and also what's needed at the time, because that's going to change depending on priorities, global priorities, different donor priorities, and your own desires as well. Just trends. I said my father started with USAID. Back then, USAID worked a lot in loans. We did a lot in loans, a lot of bilateral agreements with countries based on loan structure. And he was a loan officer early on in his career. And we quickly started to shift to a lot more projectized assistance through contracts and grants. All work through public international organizations like the UN, World Bank, and a lot of other public international organizations, which are really important to understand the full picture of international development. And then also through some budget supports. Over the years, direct budget support to countries has increased and then decreased depending on priorities, political priorities, and also confidence and relationship in the bilateral relationship. Almost every significant partner the U.S. government has had over the years has had some level of direct budget supports, whether that's Egypt, Jordan, Bolivia, Colombia, Philippines, etc. There's always been some levels, greater or lesser, of direct budget support. But that still does come into that projectized work, because even that direct budget support usually gets into levels of project demands. One of the things also to think about when you're thinking about international development is this idea of systems versus people. Direct micro impact and micro level impact and macro level impact, and how you want to engage in those different areas. We all want to impact people, but are you going to necessarily want to do that in a much more hands-on way? The easy example is the Peace Corps, of very much on the ground, very much hands-on, or are you going to try to engage at a much more macro level of systems engagement and systems change? And so those are important things to be thinking about as you look into your career. One of the other things is I talked a little bit about a few minutes ago, just about building blocks. what's important. I would say that probably across the board, no matter what area you want to specialize in and focus on, those building blocks of understanding how projects work and business, the financial side, the project development and design side, and then how those projects are monitored and evaluated, and essentially seeing what success means in a particular scenario really, really are meaningful. So let's say you want to become a global health expert and you go into global health. It's still super important to understand and be comfortable with the business of the work. And when I say the business, I don't mean for-profit business necessarily. I mean the way that success actually happens and results actually occur on the ground. And so that's really, really important to be thinking about. How do you get from dollars that donors want to contribute to work all the way to actual results on the ground? And thinking through that paradigm is really, really important. So questions that you're going to be asking definitely along the way is what are you passionate about? What's the work that you want to really lean into? And then what can you build on with that work that you're interested in? And it can be everything from that on the ground work. One of my favorite examples of an organization I worked with, it's a Scandinavian organization in Zambia, who had a tremendous impact in Zambia through building wells and pumps for wells for clean water that could actually be manufactured, maintained, and repaired in Zambia with Zambian materials. Hugely important. So sustainable. You think about sustainability. I know these terms come up quite a bit, but sustainability of your efforts versus creating dependence over time. And this is a big issue in developments. Are we, and this has been the question from the very beginning, are we creating dependence, or are we creating one of the biggest criticisms of the colonial times in many countries was a creation of a dependence on colonial countries. And in international development, what we're trying to do is move away from dependence and move towards cooperation, ultimately. You might not necessarily know that from the news, but we are working constantly towards that cooperation and that depending on one another, because resources exist all over the spectrum for us to support one another. I could talk forever about international development because of my personal passions about it, because I learned so much and gained so much from my work overseas. I served you can look on my LinkedIn profile, I served in Bolivia, Zambia, South Africa, Egypt, Jordan, Afghanistan, and loved all the experiences. And then I lived in Cameroon, Kenya, and Sudan as a child. And through the different situations, whether it's refugee work or whether it's big water projects in Jordan, it's a wide range of work that is possible in international development. So I'm going to stop there because I'm getting really close to the 10 minutes, and I know I spoke really fast, but I'm sure there'll be some time for questions, and I'm glad to be available. And hopefully Jolan and Pushmeet would pick up on these threads as well in their remarks. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you, Ralph. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Pushmeet Bhatia, and she is an attorney and former deputy director for contracts and grants for MSI, which is a major international trade and development firm. She's former director of contracts and compliance at Palladium, another major firm, and she's currently the director of assurance at BDO USA. So take it away, Pushmeet. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. I think I need to start by just thanking to be a part of this panel, because I'm no way as qualified as Ralph or Jolan. So thank you for even having me. And Ralph, this is the first time I'm meeting you. We're in the same circles. I'm sure I've heard your name so many times, but it's so good to meet you. So a little bit about myself. Let me start there. And I do want to build on things that Ralph said. My career was not very traditional. I was not, I didn't even know what USAID was when I was growing up. What development was when I was growing up. For me, development was World Bank and United Nations. That's what I thought of. I didn't think beyond that. And I did want to work with World Bank at some point in my life. When I started my education, the way I could think of getting to World Bank was through a law degree. So that's where I went. I'm not a finance person. I'm not good with numbers. So my goal was never to be economics major or try to, solve the financial issues in the world, but I wanted to make a difference. And I could see being a rule follower, I could see being able to help that way. And that took me automatically to law. I did my LLM from Case Western Reserve in Ohio. And the goal was it was comparative law because you cannot have development which is localized to a country. In the current world that we are, you have to understand how laws talk between countries and how things transfer from one area to the other. And I think it was a great call to do that, to be able to understand how different countries function. In my program, I was very lucky to have a lot of international students that I got exposed to. And during those interactions, you understand how every country has a completely different legal system. You have common law and you have civil law, and how they talk to each other and what that impact means to be able to function. When I started my career in in development, it started with education, with an education sector, but I was always a risk and compliance person through and through, probably because of my background. One thing I definitely want to share, which I maybe this was just me and I went the other way. When I got my first job, my first break as a contracts person, I remember my mentor telling me, don't worry about reading the scopes of work, just read the terms and conditions. And I didn't do that. And I thought that was the stupidest advice ever. You cannot implement a project without those two pieces, the two pieces that Ralph talked about. You need both of them to go hand in hand. You need to have the technical impact going hand in hand with the rules, because if you miss one of them, the program will fail. So the list of those career jobs that you had showed before, Melinda, you could see the balance in there, that there was enough operations and compliance people, the finance and grant managers and project managers, along with the meal people and the technical experts. They all have to balance. It's not that one is less important or one is more important, but I remember saying this to my boss at the time, that when I read the scope, I'm able to provide better support. So I will read the scope, because one problem is not the same as the other. It's not cookie cutter. What may work for a wash project in India might not work for an agriculture project in Jordan. So you cannot have the same rules. We have the same regulations. It's the same sort of principles, but how you apply them, how you translate them for a country. To be able to do that, you need to understand that country. You need to understand that country's context, the laws, the culture, all of that. So one of the very important things that I would recommend if you are thinking of a career in development is international exposure. I think there is no way to replace that, to be able to go put yourself in an uncomfortable situation through Peace Corps or through something else. Take a vacation, backpacking, but to be able to understand how people in other parts of the world live is extremely important, because without that, I don't think you'll be able to give your 100% to any work. We don't live in a world where borders are tight. They're not. Everything is interchangeable, interexchangeable. What is happening on the other side of the Atlantic is impacting, will impact. And we would be fools to say that that part of the world doesn't impact us. So to be able to understand how the other part of the world thinks, functions, what their problems are, is extremely important. My role has always been on the operations and compliance side. Um, and I think it's extremely important to not diminish that role. Um, to say, for example, I think what we're seeing right now in the news is probably reflective of that. Not to say that everything that you're hearing is true, or, I don't want to get into what's true and what's not. I don't want to touch that. But what I can tell you is that it doesn't matter how much we believe in development. At the end of the day, politics will impact everything, and politics is very individualistic. So risk and compliance, or meal, makes it worthwhile for the individual. If I'm trying to say that if you want to make an impact to someone living in Jordan, and you come back and you say that I'm going to take your money to your neighbor, I'm going to take your money and I'm going to feed someone in Jordan, there is a chance that they will say no. That is why meal is important. That is why compliance is important, to put those rules around it, to make that neighbor feel comfortable that we're going to make good use of your money. It's not going to be wasted. So we have to be able to take that guesswork away from how this money is being used. That's where the meal and the risk and the compliance factors in to show that development is effective. So it's an extremely important part of development. What you want to do will depend on, just like Ralph said, what are you passionate about? I've seen nurses make a career in development because in global health, they are passionate about working with grassroots, at the grassroots, and they make a career out of it because that's what they want to do. It really depends on what your role, what you see, how you see fitting yourself, fitting in that puzzle. Going back to the organizations that you had listed, I think it was MSI, which was my former employer, Chemonics, and there's one more that you listed, which was the third one, DT Global. Every organization, and Ralph, I'm pretty sure URC is different as well. Every organization is different on how they implement a project. And so is USAID, so is United Nations. Every organization has a different way of taking the same rules, and how they structure a team would be different. Some organizations like to keep these boxes very separate. You have a technical expert and you have your operational experts, and they work together with teams, but they don't share responsibility. A lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations, don't have that divide. Chemonics and MSI do, because they're big enough to have that much uh, years into their work that they have created that divide. But whenever an organization starts, they don't have the divide. They generally have the same person, the technical experts, understanding the rules, just like Ralph said, and implementing them. And my recommendation is to be able to do that, because that will help you understand, what do you want to do? You can choose to develop your career in either of those paths, but you need to first realize, what do you want to be? What makes you tick? What gives you that high that you want to get out of bed in the morning and go to work? So to be able to understand your own self, you need to have an understanding of the subject matter, but at the same time, you need to understand the rules and then realize, which one are you better at, or which one do you want to stick with or build upon? One cannot function without the other. It's not about seniority. It's not about who's actually making the difference. The other thing that I wanted to, and especially because we're talking to students, that I did want to say is that I've seen it in a lot of new fresh blood that just take the first job after their college, that there's a lot of resentment after a few months when they joined development. And the reason there is resentment is because a lot of people who are trying to get into development, they start their career thinking, I'm going to change the world. As experienced professionals, what we can tell you is change happens over time. does not happen in 5 days or 6 months or even 5 years. It takes decades to actually impact a change. What you want to do is you want to follow scientific methods, and you want to keep at it. The first job that most fresh out of college students get is junior project manager, right? And the most important job, the role that takes most of their time is reviewing invoices. Now, this is probably the most boring job for someone who has done a master's in global health. However, I cannot tell you how important the job is. It's an extremely important job. And as you are reviewing those invoices, with the frustration that you have, the amount of learning that comes with that job is immense, because you start to understand that business side of things that Ralph was talking about. How do you take a concept from the book and how do you put it in reality? I'll share an example about conflict of interest. Now, when we are studying development, nobody talks about conflict of interest. But conflict of interest is a subject matter. I mean, being a lawyer, it's extremely important to me, of course. But you start to realize that how important it is, even when you're trying to hire a vendor to buy blankets for humanitarian assistance. Conflict of interest is an issue you have to think about. Your employee has to be told, do not buy it from your brother because you can bring down a company. And I'm sure, Ralph, you probably know about the example I'm talking about. So it was a procurement for blankets that brought down one of the biggest development companies in 2010. So you won't realize what you're doing is important, but it's extremely important. And you have to start at the bottom and remember that you're learning every day with every small piece of that puzzle. You may just be a little screw in that machine, but that screw is really important. So don't let that impact your goal or your hope for development, and just keep at it. I'm going to stop there. I didn't even time myself, but I think I've probably said enough.
Great advice. Thank you. Okay, so last but not least, I will turn it over to Dr. Jolan Rivera, who was a development specialist for World Vision UK, another major humanitarian organization. He's been a development consultant in Ethiopia, Kenya, Honduras, Bolivia, etc. Also New England. He's still doing consulting and is a faculty member at the Carsey School. So take it away, Jolan.
Thanks, Melinda. Let's start where it all started. I was born and raised in the quintessential playground of international development. I was born and raised in the Philippines, one of those countries that for some reason is so popular when it comes to international development. I guess everyone wants to be deployed in a country made of 7,101 islands. That's when it is low tide, so it can be more, a high tide, with 300 days of sunshine. Anyway, so I was born and raised in the Philippines, and my first encounters with international development was when I was a young professional. So I'm an economist by training with special interest in cooperatives. And my first encounter with international development is when I was teaching as a 21-year-old novice economics instructor at the University of the Philippines, and we are required to do service. So as my university was partnered with a European Commission project in upland farming systems. But an economist, I will have to plot out economic cycles, etc. And I was working with some, not to be mentioned, but I will anyway, Dutch consultants, okay? And surprise, surprise, I mean, there was no context, okay? The reason why I pushed through working with international development, I left teaching eventually in the Philippines, is because I was so surprised with recommendations about water systems, etc., that took into account their experience in Bangladesh while doing work in upland Philippines. False paradigms telling the local farmers who have done upland farmings for generations how to do it in a different way. So Folks, that's my initial salvo in saying if you are interested in international development, the first thing that you have to have is cultural sensitivity. And not only in terms of like what costumes do you wear with locals, so to speak, but really understanding that systems and structures have cultural basis. When they say don't go and cut trees in the forest because you're disturbing, for example, the spirits, there is a scientific basis for that. So those kinds of like respect for me is number one, if you want to go into international development. My second exposure in international development is when I started to work for a local nonprofit, Philippine Business for Social Progress, and part of the funding comes from Canada. So these are Canadian NGOs, mostly in the French-Canadian side, that pool money and provide funding for cooperative development in the Philippines. And my job and my organization's job is actually to do monitoring of these projects. So that was my first taste of a more systematic approach to development. The idea that we don't want dependence, okay? The dependency on aid could not be sustained. So this organization or network of Canadian NGOs said, you have to learn how to locally monitor. And we were the local monitors, learning about what's happening when it comes to cooperative development in the early 1990s. And the third one is that when I was so tired of teaching economics that is Western facing, all about profits, I said, I'm done with that. And I started to work with an international NGO in the Philippines, which is Plan International, child-focused sponsorship organization that focused on development, that is more holistic in the sense that the child, while it is central to development, is concentric in the sense that there's the family, there's the community, and there's society. So the organization provided me with skills by which you would actually understand the interconnectedness, not only spatially in terms of space, but also in terms of sectorally, health, education, livelihood. Give me another hell, that would be LWHELL. Oh, that's hell, no. So let's come up with something else. So health, education, livelihood, and water, for example. So all of those things were all integrated. So the approach to community development that is integrated in nature. So folks, what does that mean? Does it mean to say, do you have to be like a jack of all trades? No, specialize in one, but please be open to the notion of interconnectedness, that you work as teams in communities. So if you are interested in community development, take a niche, one or two where you really are good at, and open your heart and mind to working with others to be able to do international development. If you take Melinda's courses, my courses, this is what we're trying to say. You need to have expertise, but at the same time, it's all about head, it's heart and soul too. And then eventually, that's being a community development practitioner in the global south. And then fast forward, I moved to the States. I did my master's, my PhD. They said, okay, teacher. I said, I don't have a green card, etc. We'll pay for it. End of the day, I'm now a citizen. Okay. So I started teaching for UNH in 2011. 3 years after, the itch to do international development was there. I've done a lot of development work in the US. I said, well, I really love to resurrect my international development work. I resigned from UNH. Goodbye, full-time permanent job. Moved to the UK and worked for World Vision. So this is what I'm going to say to you now, folks, that I was 48 years old and I got a job. And it was not a job that was ready. I logged into DevEx. On my second month of boredom, I said, okay, let me get a job. My partner moved, okay? So I had to move. And then I said, let me go look for a job. There are the search engines are your best friends, okay? Internationalorg.com, etc. A lot of these organizations, apply for them. And number two, look for websites that will say, how can you be a US citizen working in Europe? This is especially true for me now, especially with all of these things happening in the US, where there could be, maybe temporarily, I hope, limited funding for NGOs to do work from here, from the States. Well, you know what? If you want to take a leap of faith, fly to where the money is to begin with, which is in Europe. Why you have Denmark? You have Scandinavian countries that are more true to their principles of being compassionate countries. Sorry, I'm starting to be really impassioned here, but because go like Stiftung, look at Germany, look at France, etc. They have websites. Okay, look at the European Commission website. They have jobs that are Europe-based. If you want the other way around, go to Australia. Okay. The important thing though is be prepared first to see what are the requirements. You need a working visa, etc. The organization I work with, World Vision, they sponsored a lot of young Americans. I was 48, and there's like 22-year-old kid that I was sharing taxis with because we work outside of London. We taxi together or train together to be cheaper. They got there because they tried. There are a lot of UK-based organizations that sponsor Americans. Okay? They are willing to work with permits, etc. Number two, look at each of these individual organizations. What percentage of their budget comes from the U.S. state government, the U.S. government? Well, if you don't have cuts here, there will be cuts there. Thankfully, I did a little bit of research. A lot of these organizations in the UK, in Germany, in Norway, etc., they are more locally funded. They're like funded in the UK. In Europe, look for sponsorship organizations because these are funded by locals. So they are less dependent on US funding. This could be a temporary fix for now, while there's a little bit of interesting thing happening in the States. I don't want to say things, this is recorded. So interesting things happening in the States that might affect, for example, temporarily foreign aid or US aid. Then do your a little bit of, what do you call this, homework, okay? Search, 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 and then take a leap of faith, because if there is a will, as they say, there's always the way. However, please, before you go, make sure you're not that Dutch person or that American person I worked with in the Philippines that came there with a lot of heart, but not a lot of expertise. One way to do that is enroll in the GCHS program or the MCD program, where we can guarantee you that the faculty that we work with, myself and Melinda included, actually look at this combination of, being able to look at knowledge, at the same time skills that will be helpful when you work overseas. Or you can do it the old traditional way. Get employment here and be assigned over there. A little bit more difficult now. And last but not least, don't judge an NGO by its name, okay? Catholic Relief Services doesn't always mean you have to be Catholic, okay? Also, they say World Vision is like very strict because like, what do you call that? They're like this Christian beliefs that you have to swear on. Not true in World Vision UK, okay? Remember that time when like World Vision US said, oh, now same-sex couples can actually, that are married can actually work. And then after 2 days, they took it back because of this backlash from their like lovely funders, sponsors. The UK did not take it back. You can. So dig a little bit deeper. Don't go by like, cliches, etc. when it comes to these organizations. Take risk. Danish Refugee Council. That doesn't look like a biscuit or a cookie, Danish cookies. But hey, you know what? They do lots of good work, okay? We as Americans should really look at how other people are doing development work and take a leap of faith, especially if you're young. I have a lot of things to say, but for now, back to Melinda.
Terrific. Thank you all. Great advice all around. Cast a wide net. This is a global industry, folks. So whatever is going on in Washington, D.C. with USAID or with state is clearly going to have an impact, but USAID is not the only game in town. There are a lot of other funders and donor institutions around the world that will continue to fund this type of work, and the jobs are going to be there because the need is profound. And the world isn't going to suddenly change because the major foreign aid agency in the world is hitting the pause button. The need is great, and the vacuum will be filled there. The money will come from somewhere. It will perhaps take a little bit of time for these industries and these sectors to readjust, but it will happen because it has to happen because a lot of people around the world recognize the need, and these organizations do good work. They show the meal specialists show the good work that they're doing. And so I think the moral of the story and part of the impetus for putting together this webinar is that there are jobs still. There are going to be jobs. There's job growth. Everyone has been projecting job growth in these sectors. And I haven't seen anything by any of these trend spotters that suggests that that is going to change dramatically because of what is happening in Washington, D.C., although, you know, we have to wait and see. So we have a question in the chat about the dissolution of USAID. With the dissolution of USAID and foreign assistance programs government-wide, what do you see as the future of international development, particularly for federal ID practitioners? I don't know if Ralph, you want to jump in. I know you responded briefly, but you probably have more to say.
Yeah, no, glad to speak to that. Like I said in the comment, I think the opportunities are going to be there. It's just going to be it'll look differently. And I just want to give my career trajectory as an example. I grew up in international development, and I had international development kind of in my mind throughout my jobs. When I started my federal career, I started with Veterans Affairs, developed, I would say, building block skills at Department of Veterans Affairs, which does critical work that is easily translatable to the international realm. And, you know, whether that's the public health aspect of it, or it's the administration and the contracts and grants, or it's compliance, or it's finance. So building blocks, thinking about building blocks, and it is really critical, and transferable skills. So I started at VA, moved to USAID, then I went to DHS, and I worked for Citizenship and Immigration Service. And who did I end up working with while I was at Citizenship and Immigration Service, but International Organization for Migration, which does refugee work. And so DHS, though they're not typically seen in the international development sphere, because they're dealing with refugees and they have an area that deals with refugees, you have an opportunity to work in international development. So that's just one example of actually a whole host. I think at the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines, there are over 50 U.S. government agencies in Manila at the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines. And so that's just an example that no matter which federal agency you're working with, there's going to be an international aspect to it. And I could list quite a number of others as well. But the obvious one is, don't give up on the State Department, because the opportunity is definitely going to be there as an FSO. And it's a great opportunity to work as an FSO. Now, the traditional work of the State Department is not necessarily international development. But when I worked in USAID, we worked side by side with our State Department colleagues on project design, whether it was with the economic section of the embassy or the political section of the embassy, or other aspects like science and technology in a particular country to design projects, and then actually work to implement those projects. And so there's opportunities galore in the State Department as well. So that's just the U.S. government side. And that's not to, you know, you can look at Department of Justice. They have jobs overseas. There's a number of areas. But international development, I want to speak to one piece is not just humanitarian work. And that's why once you broaden your sense of what international development is, what if you're going to be working on, for instance, legal issues? Back to something that Pushmeet brought up, she made me think about this. If you're working on legal issues, let's say you're working with the Bar Association in the US, The Bar Association is a huge player in the international development realm. So you could go into law, work for the Bar Association, and then actually transfer that overseas as a consultant because of the legal system, interaction between legal systems. Because when we talk about international development, we're also talking about development of markets and legal systems and the rule of law. And so, legal opportunities exist, in tremendous fashion. Let me stop there, but I just to say there is a lot of opportunity.
If I can just add to what Ralph just said. So I don't know how much there's the news and there is the news. On the internal side, from what we are hearing from being in DC, development is not going to go away. That soft power is not going to go away. It'll just look different. And yes, it's a little extreme right now, but this happens with every administration change because every administration comes in with its priorities. It's just that what generally would have happened over 4 years has now happened in 2 months. That's why it's hitting all of us so much because it's happening at the speed at which it's happening. But every administration comes in with changes with their own priorities. So what's happening right now may change in 4 years. The other thing you always want to remember is that there is also going to be learning from what's happening right now. And that is very particular to what's happening with the current administration. If you've been following the news closely, they do something and then they immediately realize that this has been done in a certain way after 60 years of learning. And they did not know that because they did not have that experience and they were not following that experience. So they have to take their action back. So this will happen. This will evolve over the next 2 years. To stop Ebola prevention, and then they had to refund Ebola prevention because they realized actually funding Ebola prevention helps the United States. So will global health go away? No. Will humanitarian work go away? No. Will conflict resolution go away? No. All of those fields that Melinda talked about, they will stay. They might stay in a different shape or form, but it's a temporary shift of how you function in those areas. The areas will remain, the job opportunities may look different. The other thing I did want to add, because when Ralph said it, I just remembered the current acquisition and assistant head at USAID came from NASA. So it is an interchangeable field between agencies. So just because USAID goes away doesn't mean you can't work with other agencies. My own career, I started with USAID. I worked with USAID primarily for a long time, but now I have a lot of DOE clients. I have a lot of education clients, health clients, because it's the same set of rules. You just take the rules and you apply it to a different set of facts. Now, within health, let's talk about gender equality. We all know gender equality has been hurt quite badly. It's probably one of the areas that has been impacted the most. And so is that green fund that you were talking about, Melinda. Those are the two of the most affected fields in the current administration. Does that mean gender equality goes away? No. Does it mean DEI goes away? No. It may be called something different. It may look something different, and it may come back in a different shape or form in 6 months. There's already a memo going around on how the priorities of USAID development are going to change over the next 3 or 4 months. So I think my assumption, and there are smarter people here, please do feel free to jump in. But what's happening is they had to break the system and they want to rebuild. They don't want to keep it broken. They've broken the system, but now they want to rebuild a certain way. So there will be a rebuild. It might just look different.
That's a great point. And the words that we use to describe certain types of work will be different, but the work itself will be very similar, if not identical, to what was done before the words went away. especially in terms of conflict-affected societies. And in my classes, we talk a lot about, post-conflict reconciliation and social cohesion projects around the world. And, whether you call it inclusive governance or something else, if there's been a rebellion by a marginalized community because they're marginalized, the way toward peace is to include them in governance and other areas of society, and whatever you call that, that is the recipe for success. So I absolutely agree with what everyone is saying about the jobs and the nature of the work remaining the same, even as there's a restructure that will make these sectors look a bit different, especially in the US. Jolan, I don't know if
Response to
you.
what Brooklyn asked in the chat box. There is a high level of sophistication among folks that work in international development outside of the US. They definitely differentiate US policy and US people. Okay. Thankfully, we belong to a nation where we have shown as human beings a certain degree of compassion in the work that we do individually or as a group. That is what carries us in terms of like the perception of Americans. I just kind of like checked this with some of my friends, the international development field, and they say they understand it's official policy, but they also understand that Americans as people maintain to be friends. And I think it almost like gives us this additional burden of trying to prove ourselves by not only be friends, but actually we are informed friends. We will come not only with the desire to help, but also the skills and competency to make that sort of like from help to partnership, because we're not helping, we're partnering with them. So fear not, Brooklyn, I think we are perceived differently from the administration.
Great points. Any other questions from the attendees? Anything else that, sorry, I'm looking at another post. Rather than going for a graduate degree in a field as broad as global conflict and human security, would it be more beneficial to find a more niche skill set to improve upon for graduate school and then build a career from there, i.e. law, economics, health? I'll just say that it is entirely up to you, as the other panelists have said, where you want to go and what you want to do. And if you think that global health is really the area that you want to work in, then maybe it does make sense for you to get an MPH instead of a master's in global conflict and human security. Absolutely. But you just really need to know, what path you plan to take. And if you want to do a more niche program, go for that. But make sure that if you do that path, you're also getting that broad range of skill sets that are transferable, because as everyone has said, the transferable skills are what are going to help you pivot in case your particular little niche is in crisis, which sometimes happen, as we're seeing right now. Sometimes it happens that a particular sector is hit hard for whatever reason, funding goes away momentarily, and you have to pivot to something else. So you definitely want to build up those transferable skills, no matter what your degree is in. Other thoughts?
Just to add to that, don't limit yourself with that first job you get. As you've heard from all of us here, you may have a degree in MPH, you may start in health, and you might end up in law, because you will probably develop some skill sets and you will transfer. So where you start is not reflect a reflection of where you're going to end. All I can say is be open to learning, to new opportunities, experiment. I think Mr. Rivera said, take that risk, take that step of go out, work outside, meet new people, learn a new language, like Ralph said. So be open to exploring the world, and all you need is a starting point, an entry point, and after that, life will just flow with you.
Yeah, I set out to be an international development practitioner when I went to grad school, and instead I am a professor because I discovered that I love teaching in grad school, and it was totally unexpected, but here I am 17 years later at UNH. So just be open to the opportunities that arise, sometimes unexpectedly.
Yeah, I just, I mean, I think, again, I can't stress enough just the opportunity, figure out the things that are going to be useful and that you're passionate about. If you want to do public health, get the additional degree, get the degree in public health. It's not going to serve you poorly in any way. Economics always great and applicable honestly, 75 years ago when my father entered international development, applicable tomorrow. Same sort of thing. Same thing with law, same thing with business. The issue really becomes of where do you want to place your skills first. To Pushmeet's point, what's the first step you want to take, and then build from there and see where it takes you. I started at Veterans Affairs, ended up going through a career with USAID, considering the possibility of actually heading overseas to develop other skills and languages. I have friends who started as in I'll say one country in particular, Tajikistan, helping farmers. They had no ag background, but what they did is they had a really good education and they had an excitement for learning. They knew they weren't going to earn very much, but they worked for local NGOs in Tajikistan and developed language skills, and then came back to the U.S. and brought and expanded on that with their education from there. So going into places that are of interest is also, again, back to Dr. Rivera's point, take the opportunity now, when you're early in your career, to try a number of different things. And the worst thing that can happen is you can cross it off your list, but you have that experience to build upon. So it's not a loss.
Okay, great advice all around. Thank you again to our esteemed panelists. Really appreciate your insights. And of course, to our attendees, please do reach out to us with questions. I am always happy to meet with students or prospective students through Zoom or in person in Durham. So don't hesitate to reach out. We're here as a resource for you.